Hello, welcome to the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung Korea office. It is a bit of a rainy morning in Seoul, but we're happy to be here. My name is Thomas Yoshimura. I'm resident representative in Korea for KAS, and I'll be moderating and hosting today's discussion, the 2024 edition of our series of debates, videotape debates on great power relations, on geopolitics, on strategic outlook in Asia. But much more important than myself is the two great minds I'm joined by today, that are great minds on from what happens in the Indo-Pacific and on the topics that I just mentioned. I'm very happy to have you here. I would like to introduce them both. Left of me is seated Velo Nowens. Thank you very much for joining us. She is the Executive Director of the International Institute for Strategic Studies in Asia, Singapore, and therefore plays a key role, for example, in the well-known Shangri-La Dialogue. She has a broad expertise on Chinese foreign policy and defense policy in particular, also on security policy in the Indo-Pacific in more general terms, and therefore was also Senior Fellow for Indo-Pacific Defense and Strategy beforehand. And before joining the IISS, she was also at the Royal United Services Institute in London, establishing the Indo-Pacific program and focusing on China and Indo-Pacific there. She has also worked with the European Union and other international think tanks and international organizations. Furler holds degrees from the Macquarie University, the Leiden University, University of Oxford, Peking University, and also spent time at Tsinghua University. I'm very happy you're here, Velo. Thank you for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
Next to you is Professor Kuek Cheng Chui from the University of Malaysia, where he is a professor for international relations at the Institute of Malaysian International Studies, ICMAS. He's not only that, Professor Kuek is also a non-resident senior fellow at Johns Hopkins University and also a non-resident scholar at Carnegie, China, because of his broad knowledge, again, on the international security and international relations in the region here. He was a research associate at Princeton Harvard, China and the World Program, and also a fellow at Oxford University. So Kuek, it's great to have you, particularly with your background again, that will come in handy in our discussion too.
Thanks for having me here, Tom.
It's great. What are we looking at? We just saw the US presidential election between Vice President Kamala Harris and previous US President Donald Trump. And we're looking at about 8 weeks from today to go until 5th of November, when the next US president will be elected. Now, there's many reasons for the world to be interested in that election. It's certainly one of the highlights, if not the highlight, of this super election year 2024. And we could talk about many things, but what we want to talk about is our focus on the region in the Pacific in particular, on geopolitics, and how it might affect the calculations here of various countries, partner countries in the region, and how in particular it might affect also developments in the security architecture in a way. Before we go there, I would like to start with where we are and how we came here in a way. The security architecture in the region is characterized by bilateral alliances of the United States in a way, hub and spoke system, and then a lack of multilateral organizations and alliances for organizations for security cooperation or even multilateral alliances. Now, Professor Kuek, I would start with you and ask you, why is it so difficult for countries in Asia to build those multilateral security organizations or multilateral alliances, and what roles do the great powers play in that?
Thanks very much, Thomas. I thought this is a very good question, but also a difficult question. And to talk about the role and also limitation of ASEAN, I think the first thing to say is that ASEAN is a regional multilateral organization, but clearly it is not an alliance. And I would say that to talk about the role of ASEAN, I like to use 3 I. to capture, the both the plus and also the limitations of ASEAN as a regional grouping. While it is true that the difficulties, challenges, limitations have always been associated with ASEAN as a regional grouping, but I think to make things more balanced and also comprehensive, we should also not lose sight on the achievements of ASEAN despite all those challenges. So these three I's, to me, capture that dynamics. And there are realities that have been there and will continue. So I like to describe ASEAN as a imperfect, often inefficient, but always indispensable regional organization. And some would describe ASEAN, despite all the problems and limitations, describe ASEAN as the most successful regional grouping outside of EU. Some say that EU is the most successful regional grouping. Nobody would dispute that. But ASEAN clearly is not there. It's a different creature compared to EU. But among the developing countries, developing worlds or global south, ASEAN clearly stand out because of, as I said, despite the challenges, limitations, ASEAN has delivered and play a role that is indispensable, benefiting the 10 ASEAN member countries. In the process, also help all the dialogue partners in the region and also outside of the region to play a part in the region at the important areas. So I would say that the limitations and also ineffectiveness are there. People would quote, for example, the problem of Myanmar. People talk about the South China Sea issues or things that are involving sovereignty issue. Yeah? And especially those issues that involving big powers. So just like nobody would expect EU to solve Ukraine problem, I think we shouldn't expect ASEAN to solve South China Sea, multi-nation, multi-power territorial disputes. And sovereignty issues like Myanmar will always be there. Again, it's quite difficult to expect actually ASEAN to tackle that. And I would say that, but despite all those problems and inadequacies, let's not forget that ASEAN has been and will always be indispensable in a number of areas. Number one, and this is quite often overlooked by now, ASEAN was created primarily to manage the intra-ASEAN problems. It was established, in the wake of Konfrontasi for 3 years. It's not war, it's low intensity conflict, but it affects almost everyone in the region back then during the Cold War context, right?
So you would say that ASEAN has prevented at least the conflict and
that's
the war,
right.
right?
And and we could also bear in mind that before that, Southeast Asia was remembered as or described as Balkans of the East and Asia, right? Because we are so different within the national boundary and across the national boundaries. Those problems, differences can easily be spilled over as interstate conflict. Today, bearing in mind what happened during Konfrontasi, but today I think with the establishment of ASEAN, we have not really seen the kind of interstate conflict, even though we have all the reasons to go to war conflict with one another. But today, we do not think that the use of force among Southeast Asia is an option. So ASEAN quietly, people don't talk about it, but many in the ASEAN region remember that actually we don't take the regional peace, stability for granted. And the biggest role, indispensable role for ASEAN is really to manage the intra-ASEAN problem. Those problems might still be there, but at least and as long as we don't go to war, conflict among one another, I think this is already the biggest credit that we should give to ASEAN as a grouping. But ASEAN do more than that. As I said, it's a kind of a platform that allows us to have collective action. In Southeast Asia, we like to say that if we don't hang together, we'll be hanged separately. So ASEAN, in a way, not perfect, it's not a magical thing, but allow us to come together, try to manage our differences and try to come up with a common position in talking to external powers for cooperation and to manage the problems, right? And big power competition will always be there, getting more intensified. But at least it allows us to try to still come up with a common position. Not always successful, but it's better than we don't have any kind of a platform. More importantly, I think it's also indispensable in the sense that it actually allows us meaning not just ASEAN countries, but also, as I mentioned, dialogue partners in Asia and outside of Asia to come together for corporations. It's not just to avoid the problem, but to actually create something positive that will affect people and in a positive way. Since we are in Korea, let's take RCEP as an example, right? Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, the 15 nation economic cooperation that has been described as the largest FTA in the world. And it's a 15 nation in the sense that it's 10 ASEAN countries plus the 3 Northeast Asian countries of Korea, Japan, China, Australia, and also New Zealand, right? It took a number of years, 8 years negotiation, and it became a reality after like an 8-year negotiation. It came out during the height of COVID pandemic period, where for 2-3 years there was no good news at the regional global level, but RCEP came out. And I would argue, without ASEAN and ASEAN-led mechanism, RCEP would not have been possible. Things that the 3 economic powerhouses of Korea, Japan, China have been working very hard to come up among themselves for economic logic, but political logic does not allow that to happen. But with the ASEAN-led mechanism, people laugh about ASEAN as a talk shop. In Southeast Asia, we certainly don't think so. As I mentioned, it's imperfect, inefficient, but always indispensable, helping ASEAN countries and also help any dialogue partners, external powers who are willing to take us seriously.
Thank you so much. So I see it's indispensable for some regional integration, regionalism at least, also regionalization. However, you also said it in the very beginning, this has not developed and will not develop, I understand, also in an alliance, in a cooperative security, in a joint security mechanism. I would like to focus on that because there are also, of course, regional mechanisms of ASEAN focusing on security, but not turning into an alliance, multilateral alliance security cooperation system. Well, coming back to that, what would you add? What's holding back those developments? Or is it something that you see also for ASEAN that role is a security role? Where do you see that security role?
It's a really great question. And I mean, I think Professor Quick gave an excellent run through of the benefits and the challenges that ASEAN faces. I mean, maybe just to step back a little bit, I think the discussion around organizations like ASEAN is one where the focus is sometimes on the negative, on those challenges too much. I think that stems from an outsider's perspective, looking in and having almost a mirroring expectation that organizations like ASEAN will necessarily evolve into all these other ways that, say, the European Union has. Yeah. So if the European Union can, why can't ASEAN? And I think, that's probably a misunderstanding of regional expectations, of regional interests, and the comfort level at which these countries really seek to drive the evolution of these organizations. At the end of the day, it's about the constituent parts of ASEAN, of the 10 Southeast Asian member states, and their own comfort level for how far they want to take this organization. And if it ain't broke, don't fix it. There are challenges, but every single organization has those. If we look at various aspects of even the European Union, for example, not everyone's on the same page all the time, and European Union evolution itself has taken a long road to get to where it is today. So sometimes I think we forget a little bit the trajectory and the longevity and the duration and effort that it takes to get to where we were, from in the past to today in, for example, the EU. Just on ASEAN specifically in security, I mean, this is obviously a highly sensitive issue. I think we do see security cooperation between ASEAN member states to differing extents. There was the ASEAN military exercise as well, which perhaps you can speak more on. But we do see those incremental steps towards thinking about how ASEAN member states can collaborate more and cooperate more on security issues. Again, will that go towards the extent of having a unified solution on the South China Sea? We have the Code of Conduct negotiations ongoing, of course, as a diplomatic route via ASEAN and China. But whether it will go beyond that, I think, is perhaps maybe a step too far at the moment. But I will leave that to the expert to say.
Please, what do you say?
Yeah, thanks very much. And actually, I'm very kind of feel honored to have my new friend Vela joining this conversation. And if I can pick up one point that Vela highlighted early on about expectation. I think this is an important factor that we need to bear in mind when we discuss complicated issues like the multi-nation territorial problem like South China Sea. And as a Malaysian, I think we are kind of qualified to talk about this issue. Why is that? Because if you know Malaysia and Malaysia's external relations and external issues enough, you will know that South China Sea issue is not the only territorial problems that Malaysia has. In fact, as a country that lie at the center of Southeast Asia, or now we would say at the center of Indo-Pacific, between the two oceans, for geographical reason and for historical reason, Malaysia actually inherited a number of territorial problems. You looked at the map, we have territorial problems with almost every neighbors, either by sea or because of the land border, right? With kind of Indonesia, Singapore, Brunei, Vietnam, and my Philippine friends will remind me that they have never given up Sabah, for example. So we do have territorial problems, the long list, and the judgment is that among ASEAN member countries, among fellow ASEAN members, we have not really able to resolve even those bilateral territorial problems with the immediate neighbors, with ASEAN fellow member, let alone to solve multi-nation territorial problems. The bottom line is that we don't want to go to war. We don't want, the conflict, the disagreement, disputes to escalate into tension and also conflict. If we are not going there, I think other things we can manage and find some mechanism in one way or another. Not perfect, but again, we need to realize that all politics is local. All politics is domestic. In ASEAN countries, we have a lot of long list of domestic problems. So it's not like we put aside the territorial problem, but it's just that I think with that realistic expectation in mind, we need to find a way, and we'll say multiple ways. ASEAN will have to be a part and parcel of the equation. But clearly with ASEAN it's not enough, which is why we need the security arrangements. But security arrangement is not the simple issue, black and white issue of alliance or no alliance. I think ASEAN countries rejected that kind of either or. We think that, alliance might be necessary, especially for those who have always been part of alliance, right? So we know Philippines and Thailand, they have been the treaty allies of US since last century at the height of Cold War. But others decided not to adopt alliance as a kind of like external approach. But it doesn't mean that we dismiss security arrangement. We do pursue a lot of alignment arrangements, right? It's an alignment without alliance. And alignment that is not necessarily targeting at anyone, but mainly for contingency. We would invest, involve, and adapt based on the degree of threat perception, danger perception, so on and so forth. Yeah.
Let me stop you here because I think we have painted a pretty good picture also of where we are and why we are here. But you already alluded to there's still many things also in security realm going on in terms of cooperation. And one of the phenomena that I want to pick out here is the trend away from that purely bilateral network that we have in the region, more also into a cooperation between states that are either aligned with the United States or even not, but also among those allies of the United States, that cooperation, that network that goes in Southeast Asia as well as in Northeast Asia among the spokes, among the partners. So, for example, also including the Republic of Korea and its increasing cooperation also in security terms with other partners. Where do you see that, Val? Do you see it as something that fits into the picture we just painted? Do you see it as a new trend and as something to continue over the next time?
Yeah, absolutely, Thomas. Look, I think given the security situation in the Indo-Pacific and how that has evolved quite drastically over the last couple of years, or intensified over the last couple of years, be that the issue of North Korea, be that nuclear dynamics more generally, including, of course, between the United States and China, maritime security around the Taiwan Straits, and of course, South China Sea. I mean, all of these issues have really, I think, come to the forefront and awakened a sense that there needs to be a greater effort between countries to build cooperation mechanisms amongst them. So no longer just relying on the United States. There are debates, of course, already ongoing with the war in Ukraine, now the instability in the Middle East as well, over the overstretched capacity, perhaps, of countries like the United States to be able to respond to those, and also potential contingencies and instability in Asia. So there needs to be, I suppose, from the perspective of these allies, greater networking, greater mechanization, institutionalization of their defense relationships amongst one another to relieve the burden, I think, a little bit on the United States as well. We see that evolving in different ways. You see that in defense technological cooperative mechanisms like AUKUS or even GCAP. You see that through information sharing relationships. You see it in the field of military exercises, but also in reciprocal access agreements. That's the kind of defense element. Very closely linked to that, of course, is also the geoeconomic element, where security now is far more than just boots on the ground, ships at sea, planes in the sky. It is about technological partnerships. It's about supply chains. It's about all of these other vulnerabilities that need to be redressed in a very globalized world where resilience now comes down to the very, very kind of economic level as well. And so, we've seen this within the US alliance system, where it's no longer, as you say, the hub and spokes. It's now also coming through partnerships such as Philippines, US, and Japan, Philippines, Australia, and Japan, ROK, Japan, and the United States. So these different formations that create really a new mosaic of the alliance relationship. But coming back to Professor Quick's point on alignment.
Call me Cici.
Cici, I'll call you Cici then. Coming back to Cici's points on, adjusting and aligning, even if not through alliances, I think this has really emerged over the last couple of years as well, is trying to understand how you can build cooperative relationships with countries in the region who might not hold all the same values as yourself, but who themselves are incredibly important players in the region. So the relationship and the strategic partnership with Vietnam, for example, that I think is a way that we see different partnerships in the region seek to find ways in which groupings of the able, the willing, and those who are ready enter into new partnerships where they can further on specific issues of cooperation, be that in the defense realm or be that in the economic realm.
Cici, how does this thickening of the web, let's call it, of cooperation, also in those two, economic security, maybe also a security defense realm, how does it look from Kuala Lumpur? Is that a trend you see similarly?
All right, I would like to say that I will reflect my view as an academic, not necessarily from Kuala Lumpur, Putrajaya, or Jakarta, or elsewhere. But I like all the points highlighted by Vela, and then to complement or to kind of engage the very important points that she highlighted. I think I would highlight 3 points, 3 A's, to capture the complexity and also the ambivalent perceptions on the part of Southeast Asia countries and also smaller countries or middle states who are sandwiched between the 2 competing superpowers of United States and China, right? It's 3 A's. First A is what have been highlighted both by you, Thomas, and also Vela, is about alliance, right? So alliance, again, I think it's certainly a big instrument for all countries' foreign policy, not just in Asia, anywhere else, right? And alliance clearly is needed, especially if you have an immediate, profound threat that you cannot tackle on your own. You would join someone stronger in order to push back. So Malaysia was in that kind of equation. In fact, the first 14 years of Malaysia's history was not about hedging, was not about non-alignment, right? It was alliance, Anglo-Malayan Defense Agreement, right? So that agreement, that bilateral alliance, not multilateral, but bilateral alliance, helped Malaysia as a new nation, small nation, vulnerable nation, to tackle security problems internally and externally in the form of communism, in the context of Cold War politics, right? In a neighborhood, when you have problems like confrontasi we mentioned earlier on, again, UMDA played that role to tackle that regional challenges, right? And it worked very well and it's indispensable. Without UMDA, I think Malaya and then Malaysian, when Malaysian was formed in 1963, would not be kind of like sustained in that Cold War context and also, violent and then military force is still quite a challenge. But as in many other things in life, right, many other good things in life, everything will come to an end. So when British, for their own domestic problem, would have to, adjust their policy, East or West policy, 1966-67. And then saying like, they would be like militarily retreating East or West. There was a turning point. Suddenly we realized that having invested all our eggs in the alliance basket, UK directly, US indirectly, but when for some reasons, it's not their choice. We understand that it was not the UK's choice. But when they had to go, they had to go. And this was followed by Nixon doctrine, right? US, because of the military setback in the Vietnam War, had to withdraw militarily from mainland Southeast Asia. So these two moments that happened in late 1960s was kind of like a watershed moment. We suddenly realized that alliance, however strong, positive and help us in many ways, directly and profoundly, might not be able to sustainable. There will be some unpredictability that is beyond our control. We would love to have it. It's plan A. But plan A might not last forever. And then, so those non-alignment and neutrality, regional neutralization, ZOP things came right after that. And so it was no coincidence why Malaysia chose to be the first in the ASEAN region to have diplomatic rapprochement with normalization with PRC, despite the ideological differences and during the Cold War, right? So this year we are celebrating the 50th anniversary, Malaysia-China relationship. But that's the first A. So alliance has always been good and necessary, especially when you are confronted by direct threat. But again, let's very quickly to jump on to the second and also the third A. Second A is about alignment, right? Alignment is a security defense arrangement, but some would apply it in a broad way, not necessarily just military. You can also have economic or diplomatic, but that's not going to that. It's a conceptual debate among IR scholars. But let's just focus on defense alignment. So I think defense alignment is a indispensable and necessary component for all countries, even those countries in ASEAN who announce and emphasize that we are non-aligned, right? But non-aligned doesn't mean that we are completely without any alignment arrangement. As I said, it's often alignment without alliance. So what is the difference between the two? Yeah, it's both about military cooperation, but alliance is with mutual defense commitment. Your security is my security and vice versa is true. When you're being attacked, my people are obliged to shed blood over your security. So it's a pro and con. We know that is good, but under certain conditions. So learning from history, we learned that alignment would have those benefits. You keep options open. You have partners to collaborate, but without that kind of like problems, that the uncertainty that come with alliance, and you also signal to every powers, especially competing powers, that we are not choosing sides. Right? And this brings me to the third A, right? Autonomy. So smaller countries in Southeast Asia, we do have something in common, post-colonial states. Autonomy is important. We want security, we want prosperity, we also want autonomy. In order to strike a good balance, in the absence of direct threat, we want to try as much as possible to pursue all three things: security, prosperity, and also autonomy. And therefore, alignment is being chosen as the primary approach for many ASEAN countries. Perhaps the Philippines right now, with what is going on in South China Sea is an exception. But you look at Thailand, another treaty allow US, also choose something similar compared to Malaysia, Indonesia, Singapore, Vietnam, so on and so forth, right? So I think autonomy will be an important point to understand our kind of ambivalent approach towards the alliance and US-led alliance network.
You should make it the 5 A's. You should add ambivalence, and you should also add agency.
Yeah. It's
So I
there, yeah.
think-
There's to elaborate. So I will give you also a follow up here because you have already said that this is an ambivalence towards the US-led system there. So, and I also see that hesitating to join maybe alliances, and you mentioned also exceptions that have alliances with the United States of America as an external great power, and the experience of the Malaysian case that for reasons beyond control, of course, some alliances may not uphold to some of the expectations and reliance that you had on them. But there might also be other reasons to not choose the alliance, but stick to a mixture of alignments, and also then the normalization that you mentioned that Malaysia had early on after that experience. Alliance is not the choice with the People's Republic of China. So here it is, the big powers, Malaysia somewhat in between and trying to find a balance there as well. Let's talk about this a little more and how it works, how realistic it is. I know you're an expert. I should say that again, the middle power strategies and what all comes into that. Please elaborate a little bit more on that balance.
Sure. I think this is a very complex, difficult question. So I guess to cut the long answer short, the best way to kind of respond would be about non-alignment via multi-alignment. I think this is a trend that we are seeing happening. And the word the non-alignment in this case, especially in today's context, does not necessarily means that there is no kind of a defense arrangement mechanism at all. But non-alignment rather is a goal, is a policy ends. It means that we are not taking sides with any of the competing powers. We are kind of forming arrangement with this and that country, but not necessarily targeting anyone. So it's not non-alignment in the sense that not taking sides. And that, as I said, is a policy goal, is a policy ends, but the means to achieve that policy ends and goals is through multi-alignment. Multi-alignment meaning that you are forging, you are maintaining, you are expanding defense mechanism cooperation in all forms that Vela highlighted very well earlier on. And with multiple countries, and some countries are your long-standing defense partners, right? More often than not, within the maritime Southeast Asian countries, you know that the key long-standing players, defense players, are Western powers. So those have been continued. Right? Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, and so on and so forth have always been continued. But multi-alignment with some characteristics, right? So I would add 3 more words to describe what kind of multi-alignment that we are talking about, right? So multi-alignment in active way, multi-alignment in inclusive way, and multi-alignment in prudent way. So it's non-alignment as a goal by multi-alignment as a means, but implemented in active, inclusive, and prudent way. Active in the sense that we know that today, survival instinct tell us again and again that you shouldn't just sit there and pray you will not be affected by the big power politics. You know it's there, you will continue for the next decades. When and how it will end, we do not know, but we do know that it will affect us. So I think passive reactive, I believe, is not an option for any country in the region. Some are more active than the others, but we all try to active in one way. As you mentioned earlier on about agency, right? Mm-hmm. Small states, weaker states do have agency. So active is one way. It's one important kind of guiding point for not just policymakers, but I think for analysts as well. We are seeing that happening. And as I said, some are more active than the others. The second point that we need to bear in mind is inclusive, right? If we are trying to pursue a multi-alignment for diversification purposes, to diversify strategic and development partnerships without putting all eggs in any power's basket. And diversification has to be done in this current context, especially in inclusive way. If we are diversifying only within one camp, Western camp, Indo-Pacific camp, that is not the inclusive diversification. And therefore, you see that many countries, old and new members of ASEAN, as we continue to maintain, expand, defense partnership alignment with traditional powers from the West, we make it a point to start or pursue some cooperation with China too. Military exercises, consultation. Indonesia just had 2+2 with China. Those are indicators of active and inclusive. Finally, final point is about prudent, right? Prudent means that you try to achieve some kind of balance. Sometimes you do need to offset, right? When you are sick, you are sending too much a positive signal to one power. You need to make sure that these have to be prudently offset to another power so that you have some kind of balance. It's beyond our control, but I think the efforts to do inclusive, active, prudent, multi-alignment will always be there. So non-alignment is not like the context that, the kind of non-alignment that we talk about during the Cold War context, right? Today's non-alignment is mainly a goal, but the means are multiple. And multi-alignment, it's already emerging.
How do you see the conditions for that? Also, against the background, you have talked about it further earlier. It's not only about security, it's about economic backgrounds, supply chains, technologies, where we also see a trend towards a pressure, maybe a felt pressure at least, to taking sides. Does that worsen, improve, or just keep up the conditions for multi-alignment?
So maybe I'll just step back a little bit and return to something that CC said, because I think that multi-alignment is a really interesting development. And the great thing is that with the rise of the Indo-Pacific strategically in the minds of so many different corners of the world, the menu of options for countries here is rising. And that actually makes multi-alignment a little bit easier these days than it was in the past. Be that on economic terms, be that on defense cooperation, capacity building terms, development capacity building as well, or indeed in technology partnerships. That doesn't mean that the contours of great power competition go away. It doesn't mean that it is necessarily a completely easy navigatable space. If we take, for example, supply chains, the technological development space, and the choices that countries need to make, sometimes at the end of the day, great powers make those choices for you. And when we look at, say, export controls from the United States that we have seen emerging since last year, and the expectation is that those will continue irrespective of the future US president, whoever wins the race. There are debates, of course, how small that yard and how high that fence will remain, and whether that will actually become a bigger yard and an even higher fence. Those types of challenges will ultimately still be there for countries in Southeast Asia, but the rest of Asia to deal with too. And to be honest, looking at European powers, the Netherlands, for example, has had to, face that challenge as well. This is not just an issue that Asia will need to navigate very carefully. Again, there's only two big powers in the world who really can set that parameter. And for everyone, that's going to be a major, major challenge.
But you think it's, at first I understood, since there's so many fields and the garden is getting bigger, we also have different places to maybe apply those different strategies. CC, is that concurrent with what you think?
I concur completely. And I think Vela's insights capture the dynamics very well. And it reflects something that is beyond our control. It's top down, right? How the two competing powers will act and react is beyond us, strategically and also economically and technologically. But there are also kind of a reflective of what is going on, that we also realize that as smaller countries in Southeast Asia, we are not the only group of middle state sandwich between the two. We saw European countries. We saw those countries that kind of like rally behind the Indo-Pacific, as indicators that they are also as concerned as us, right? So that actually help to provide more alternative, as you mentioned earlier on. So in a short Southeast Asia or many Middle States, the perspective is that the more the merrier. There are things that beyond our control, but there are also things that because of some converging interests, we come together and it open up a lot of possibilities. 2 + 2 clearly is not between 1 or 2 power, either in the region or outside the region. I think from now on, you are going to see more and more, right? The more the merrier in that sense.
So the picture we painted about how it is now is going to get even more complex. Still multilateralism, I still think you would be optimistic for ASEAN, of course, but still those minilateral, those selective groupings will maybe increase, different choices make. Where do you see that, the perspective? How do you assess this perspective for multilateralism, minilateralism, and stability in the security environment for Asia? CC.
This is I would say, multi-million question. And to respond to that is that I think we need to distinguish them into two. One, it's goals and means. The other are approaches, right? Stability clearly is a goal, is a mean, is an end, policy end. And it's not the only end. Other than stability, we want security. We want prosperity. We want, again, as we mentioned earlier on, autonomy. Those are clearly policy ends that countries, big and small, medium, we all want it. How to pursue that? Those are bilateralism, minilateralism, and multilateralism. I think this is a big picture issue, so that would be the first point. Second point is that we need to highlight. We realize that with Indo-Pacific discourse deepens and gain momentum. Today, almost everyone would associate the term minilateralism with Quad, with the so-called Indo-Pacific partners. Let me say that as an academic who follow the development in Southeast Asia, we in Southeast Asia actually will remind that the word minilateralism is not an invention, it's neither an invention nor monopoly of Quad and also Indo-Pacific powers. Because, for example, we mentioned UMDA early on, right? So when UMDA was replaced by FPDA, Five Power Defense Arrangement, there was a minilateral that involving 2 ASEAN countries, Malaysia and Singapore, and 3 Western powers, right? And UK, Australia, New Zealand, right? So we did see the early form of minilateralism, not alliance, not quite regional cooperation, but somewhere in between, some kind of alignment, and continue until today, right? Expanded from military to non-military security cooperation and all that. And then among ASEAN countries, we have, it's often overlooked, ASEAN or ASEAN base, or some say ASEAN minus, minilateralism. Yeah? Malacca Strait Patrol, involving Malaysia, Indonesia, Singapore, and then Thailand joined later on. And then on the other side of the water, we have a TCA, Trilateral Cooperative Arrangement, Malaysia, Indonesia, Philippines. And we say the door is open for Brunei or others who wanted to join. So those are minilateralism. And third point, and I will end there, it's I think Southeast Asia mindset is such that we rarely see things as either or. It's not an issue of minilateralism versus multilateralism, or whoever's minilateralism versus others' minilateralism. We want them all. The mindset is such that as things become more uncertain, we want more options rather than less option. The more the merrier, as you rightly emphasized. And then we want to actually feel that all those things many are beyond our control, but if they are good for us as a country or as a region, our answer is, why not? Let's do that, but bit by bit. And again, we will do it in active, inclusive, and prudent way. Selective, as you rightly mentioned.
Thank you. I would have another $1 million question for you, Val, because I want to close the circle where we started and where I started looking at the presidential debate in the United States. We have the election upcoming. We have a complex picture, and CC just said it might just be traditionally complex and remain complex and get more and more complex. How much complexity will be added by the US elections? What influence does that really have, whether it's a return of US President Donald Trump or Vice President Kamala Harris becoming the next president of the United States? What's your take?
I mean, irrespective of the US elections, I think the world is becoming a more complex place than a less complex place. So that will only continue. I think with regards to the US elections specifically, of course, with should Kamala Harris win the elections, I think there's a greater level of certainty and continuity that can be expected from the Biden administration, which makes it easier for countries to navigate that perhaps. I think with President Trump's first time in office, I think the start was a little bit chaotic. Countries in this region, for example, but also in Europe, weren't quite sure who to speak to about what in the administration. Decision-making and policy direction took different turns. And that could perhaps be expected again from President Trump 2.0. So I think there's some uncertainty, some greater uncertainty that comes with the Trump 2.0 administration. But one thing I think is certain, competition with China is not going to go away. We've mentioned so many different areas where that will remain in the military realm, in the technological and economic competition. In all those spaces, in all those domains, you will continue to see competition between these two countries who are in lockstep on that. And, trust, despite small increases recently in efforts to increase dialogue, I think these are tactical changes. They are not fundamental strategic changes in the bilateral relationship between these two major powers. And that poses continued challenges for countries in Southeast Asia and the wider Indo-Pacific region. I think, in areas of economic competition, it'll be interesting to see how either of those candidates will pursue an economic plan for the Indo-Pacific. CPTPP looks like it will not be on the table again for a very long time to come. So how does the United States build on IPEF? The Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. These are issues that for countries in the region who are developing, who are really looking for greater investment, greater trade opportunities, greater growth strategies, these are the things that matter. And so for the United States, for example, it'll be really, really key for both candidates to outline what their plan is for this part of the world. For countries in the region, I think, to feel more comfortable that that menu of options is widespread, and it includes both the big powers and those other small and middle powers that CC already spoke about.
CC, what's your thoughts when you look at the ongoing election campaign in the United States? What do you expect from those elections? Will it make your thinking here in the Indo-Pacific more complex?
Yeah, completely agree. And actually, I do feel blessed to speak after a great mind, Vela here, because she has already tackled the difficult and big questions, issues. So that makes my job, I guess, easier. I can bandwagon, agree with what you've just mentioned, but adding some lesser points in the sense that, number one, I think uncertainty is getting deeper and so widened. And Southeastern countries actually are quite I would say used to, but we have been living under uncertain conditions in regional global level. So that's something that we know will continue, but I agree that the different administrations would present a different level and forms of uncertainty, right? Harris administration, I think we can expect more continuity in many ways. IPEF has hopes to be continued. But if it is Trump, we know that things would be more, if Trump 2.0, it will be more unpredictable in so many ways, strategically, diplomatic and economic, so on and so forth, right? So that's the first point. Second point, as an academy, I also come across a lot of comparison analysis. Some say that with the Trump 2.0 uncertainty, some observers say that US allies in Europe and Asia seems to be more nervous than countries in Southeast Asia. I completely agree. And then there are some explanations. Some say that ASEAN countries are perhaps too naive or overly optimistic about the challenges that might be coming from Trump 2.0 and all that. I'm sometimes kind of like disagree. I would say that we would say that the reason, the comparison is correct one, and we might be seems to be less nervous, but that can be a function of many reasons. One is that because things are always relative. The risk perception, threat perceptions is a long list of things, right? And in Southeast Asia, our leaders wake up every morning and not thinking about Trump 2.0 or Harris or US and China. We wake up, leaders wake up every day, every morning to think about domestic. So we have bigger problems and pressing problems and challenges confronting the policymakers, leaders in ASEAN capital and beyond. And therefore, we knew that those are beyond our control. One at a time. We would adjust accordingly. So that would be my second point. And then last point that Vela highlighted was about you think you bring in the China factor, right? So I think China factor is a reality again. It's part of the wider realities that smaller countries, middle states, either in ASEAN region or beyond, see that it is part and parcel of the reality. Southeast Asia more so, in fact, some would say that geography means that China factor is a permanent factor for all these ASEAN countries. And therefore, with that uncertainty, much of them, much not all, are beyond our control. Big powers, their DNA is to compete. Whoever in charge in White House, Zhong Nanhai, we know that is structural. They will compete. And we know that that competition will affect us in many ways, positive and negative, sometimes more negative than positive. Even economically, the supply chain that you mentioned earlier on, we are benefited, right? Vietnam and Malaysia benefited from the semiconductor supply chain restructuring and all that as firms, multinational firms move out of China. So China plus one benefited us. We are benefited from big power competition. But again, as smaller countries historically vulnerable, we know that this thing might not last. And there is a price, there is a trade-off for many things. And therefore, it's not like we are too naive or too reactive, but we do know that active, inclusive, and prudent would be the way to go to guide our policy options. And the good thing is that it is not either or. It's the more the merrier. And we are seeing all these means that Thomas, you highlighted, minilateralism, multilateralism, mini-multilateralism, many said for bilateralism, would always be part and parcel of necessary means in our toolbox to respond accordingly. Which one is primary or secondary? I think it varies issue from issue. And then also it depends on how the two big powers will act and react and how do they treat us, right? If one or two of them treat us very badly, I think we will adjust accordingly. I think fundamentally, I believe that the middle state statecraft, if we could use those academic terms, is that will be adaptive but prudent. We will adjust accordingly based on the level of uncertainty, based on the level of dangers, and based on what options do we have. So middle states, middle power in Asia and Europe do have something in common. Despite the way we see things might be different, but we do have a lot in common. And I do agree with your assertion, observation earlier on that there will be multiple options available. Not necessarily convenient or straightforward, but at least more options are better than less or no options.
Thank you so much. I think also we have in common, of course, the interest in the elections, but we also have interest in understanding, of course, China, understanding also the Indo-Pacific and the complex picture that we looked at today. I thank you very much for giving us some systematic approaches to look at those and better understanding and sharing your insights to help us maybe predict a little of where everything's going or remaining. Some of the things will just keep us busy over the years to come. Thank you. It was a very great pleasure to have you, and I look forward to more exchanges in the future.
Danke. Thank you. Kamsahamnida.